I get a lot of students asking me, like now, have graduated, they go, oh, if you can't employ me, what can I do to get work? And I think it's about preparing. It's not just what can I do at the end of my degree. It's like, well, you should have started a while back.
All right, let's get started.
Easy.
So this is Site to Studio episode 5. Thank you for coming down, Ritz. Ritz?
Yeah, cool.
Nervous, huh?
Is this being filmed?
Yeah, it's being filmed there.
So should I look at the camera then? I've had my back to the camera, Charlie.
Yeah, that's okay. We're good now.
Okay.
So we don't have much time. So
Yep.
Could you start off by just telling us a little bit about yourself and what you do?
Okay. I am a co-director at Ritz and GHOUGASSIAN Architects. We do both interiors and architecture. And I handle the architectural projects in the studio, and Jean-Paul will handle interior design projects in the studio. But it's definitely, not a one's yours, one's mine. We approach everything in a holistic manner. And so every project has a thorough interior and architecture design ethos behind them.
Right. So just pulling back a few years, I guess, how did you get into architecture?
I actually studied engineering and economics at Monash. And whilst they were interesting, I knew they weren't right. I just kind of flowed through them, and eventually I just wanted to graduate so I could start. I decided architecture is what I need to be doing. So I sorted out my graduation, and then Melbourne were offering a postgrad in architecture, which appealed to me because it meant I didn't have to do all the preamble of subjects that you do to get acquainted, with the university. A lot of them I think are great, but you don't need, it's sort of, if you've done one, you've done them all. And so I did a couple of design subjects outside of a degree as part of, I think it was the Bachelor of Environments, and loved it. And I used those subjects and that design work that I did as part of my portfolio and applied to Melbourne, along with my academic transcripts and an essay and, all that type of stuff. And, got in, loved it. Like I knew as soon as I started, this is what I should be doing. It's just a click. You just feel it. And went through that, thoroughly enjoyed university, studying architecture, started to think about work as well, because I remembered when I graduated with economics, the one thing I remember is that I always thought to myself, I didn't do enough internships when I was studying. So learning from that, I went out straight away after my first, it was a 3-year course. After the first year, I had an internship at Plus Architects. And again, that just something I put on the resume. I get a lot of students asking me, like now, have graduated, they go, oh, if you can't employ me, what can I do to get work? And I think it's about preparing. It's not just what can I do at the end of my degree. It's like, well, you should have started a while back. And so it's being proactive like that. And I did that. And I started working then, got another internship the following year at a small studio called Architecture Works in South Melbourne. And John and Steve were great to me, looked after me. And but being a small studio and being a student, they needed someone who had to commit a bit more. So I then needed something in my final year. And in my final year, I got an internship with Woods Baggett through a friend of a friend who put me in contact with someone there. And again, they were fantastic. From day one, they looked after me, and I kept on telling them, I said, when I graduate, I want a job. So they gave me a job when I graduated, and a couple of years later, I was getting registered. I was working at Room 11, who's rebranded as Edition Office. They sort of split from their Hobart studio. And from them, I learned some great detailing. And with a few projects that JP, my business partner, had in the works, we could go off on our own and set up our studio. So we set up Ritz and GHOUGASSIAN, I'm the Ritz, he's the GHOUGASSIAN. And we created a studio based off what was initially a lot of hospitality projects. Now we shifting gears a little bit into some larger commercial projects. We're doing residential, we're doing multi-residential. I kind of like to think we'd take on anything. Being a small studio, every project is unique. So it's not like we have any formulas to create one project after the next. But that's the sort of, that's a little backstory of me.
Right. So you launched the business in 2016.
Yeah.
What have been some of the core business challenges that you've experienced or are currently dealing with?
I think the biggest challenges I find is actually every time we want to expand a little bit, like employing people. Okay, well, how do we do that? Moving offices. Okay, all of a sudden we went from a shared space to our own office. You quickly realize, there's these other bills you got to pay. So it's like the business side of things, those growing pains every time we shift up a gear. It's those things that are a little tricky, but having a great accountant helps. Don't manage things you don't know about yourself. Trust an expert. What else is tricky? Good consultants can be tricky. Finding the right mix of engineers, building surveyors, town planners. Trusting trades as well. Like yourself, I can trust Charlie, But it's understanding that, because you in a way, when it comes down to, like, say, the architectural side of things, you want to draw something up, but you also want to understand how someone like yourself is going to put it together, And so there's that. What I enjoyed when we did my brother's cabinet was actually the shop drawing process, because I think that's where things are resolved. I'll draw something to a point, and then a steel fabricator or a joiner or a windows supplier will kind of complete the picture, and then I'll check that, and we'll work together to complete the image. So there's that understanding on the architectural side of things and the interior design side of things.
Right. So you mentioned about scaling in labour resources, hiring people. That's something even in sort of the architectural joinery space that I really struggle with, the idea of, you hire someone, but then you lower profit margins, or can you rely on this person, most importantly, to do the work to carry out the vision? Yeah. So in a creative studio, that challenge almost seems insurmountable to me. So how do these big firms scale, and how do they do that?
Well, big firms, I think everyone would probably do it differently. I mean, I know that they'll just they've got resources. They can just throw resources at an HR team to put together, experienced architects or experienced building designers, professionals to get the job done. But from a small business point of view, it's a little bit more challenging. And I think the onus always comes directly back on to myself or JP, for example, because at the end of the day, I'm not going to hire someone experienced, because I need to hire somebody who's going to. I want to teach someone how to do it my way, And I think that that's tricky, because I've got to teach them, first of all, the software that we're using potentially, but also the way and the methodology in which I like to work. Scaling in, scaling out, doing things at different scales, and making sure that the detail's picked up at the right point. So there's no point having a big fuzzy section at 1 to 100. You want to make sure the drawings are clear. And so you're not putting the detail in at 1 to 100. You might be putting the detail in at 1 to 10. That's when you want to make sure the drawings are millimeter perfect. And it's just understanding that process. And that's time consuming. We've hired 2 people this year, and a lot of my day gets eaten up answering their questions, teaching them the way I want to do it. I guess in the long run, that's going to pay off, because assuming they stay on with us, that they've learned how to do it, and it's starting to save me time. So it's a chance you take.
Yeah. So you're finding that the management costs associated with employing people is quite significant in that early stage, because you have to invest heavily into training these people to make sure that But how good is good enough, I guess? So I sense from you that you are a quote unquote perfectionist. So do you grapple with this idea of, well, my employee only needs to be 80% as good as me, or do you expect perfection, quote unquote?
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't expect perfection because I think that things are always a work in progress. Nothing is set in stone. Even when a building's built, it's never completed. In a sense, it's aging, it's changing, it's adapting, it's shifting in the ground. You know, everything's always in flux. But what I do like is that when we're drawing something up, that, yeah, dimensions are clean. Things are drawn, you know, if I want something to be drawn at a metre, it's not just drawn slightly off-angled or it's just shy of a metre. I want it to be 100% on point. And that's what I like about, you know, computer-aided drawing is that you can, you know, click to things and you can't hide. You can't hide from the detail. You know, if something's out by 2 mil on the computer screen, it's going to be out by 2 mil, if not more, when you build it. So now that's not in any way a creative process, right? That's purely a more methodical, quantitative process. When you talk about creativity, often a sketch might look right, and then it's about how do we adapt something that's very brush stroke driven into something that's very precise, and there's a process in that too. But there's something nice about being able to do both well, you know?
Yeah. So you mentioned before another challenge was finding or trusting the trades, because there often is quite a big disconnect between the drawings, no matter how well detailed, and what actually gets built. So just to provide some value to the subcontractors and tradespeople out there, what are some ways that they can add value to the process for you?
For us, it's about getting that conversation occurring early on in our design process, and also the continued relationship with a particular contractor or subcontractor, because we do it once, we can do it well. Next time we do it, we're not making the same mistakes again, and also the details are tweaked just that little bit more, and each time we do it, it gets better and better. Errors, I think it all comes down to that you know, mitigating errors or trying something, seeing a pathway to do something even better, but you can only see that once you give it a go. You know, in a way, architecture is a prototype every time we do it, but there are certain things that you can get a handle of and simplify each time you do them.
Yeah, and so that helps with the scale aspect as well, especially if, and I feel that same way as well from my perspective. You know, from job to job, you are building a prototype every single time. You know, in a kitchen, you might have 3 different finger pull details. You're going to have different grain directions, different finishes, different panel gaps. So by working with the same architects, that does help create some semblance of a system and fixed process within the operation. Otherwise, it's so fragmented and scattered.
Yeah, and it's also interesting with, like, in that sense of process, because there becomes it's not written down in any way, but you realize how one another likes to work, you know, and you start to get in the mind of each other. And so without even saying anything, you can almost pick the right or make the right decision. You know, you say, oh, Charlie, you know, I know that he can't do that detail that way, but he's got it. If we adjust it and we do it this way, I know he can still achieve it. And likewise, you might say, oh, Gil hates those butt ends or something like that, and you know, and so you present something to me that's already halfway to what I like, and then the conversation is faster and we resolve things quicker.
So in this world where architects and builders are constantly struggling to find high quality contractors, what are some things that you think architects can do, whether it's in their documentation or the way or their process or how they're communicating, to increase the probability or the chances of them finding the best people that they can trust for their projects?
It's a hard one. I don't know if it's about what we put in our documentation. Obviously, the more detail, the better. But I think at the end of the day, it's going to come down to time and cost, and trying to convince whether it might be the client or the contractor that it might cost a little bit more to do something this way. But if everything's been documented and detailed, it's a faster process in the end. But it's a hard conversation to have. We had a project in South Melbourne, and I still think the project would have been better having done some stack bond brickwork inside. They chose to do, your sort of common bonds, your stretcher bonds, and the project would have been stronger had that been the case, in my opinion. And I think it's these fine lines that you draw between one or the other, and they make a huge difference in my mind. And I think that the more you can push, the better that project's going to be. But ultimately, I don't know how other people view it. They may not see that.
Yeah. So you just spoke to the alignment of the architect's vision to the client's perception of value, or how much money they want to spend.
Perception
or
of
whatnot.
value, yeah.
Yeah. So how do you? That's a serious struggle, I imagine, because the architects, because you're not doing this even more than 50% because you're trying to make money. It's about creating something. Well, it's about creating something.
Well, that's it. I don't. The way we structure our fees, I don't get paid more because I get stack bond in a project or stretcher bond. Do you know what I mean? So it's very much about almost you take on. I always like to think of the project as its own entity, and you take on that project, and it becomes something that you fight for, to give it life and to give it a strong architectural identity. And in order to do that, you have to have fights sometimes with people, because you want it to come about in the best way possible.
I like that. Something that I have found interesting on architect-run projects is by removing the client from micro decisions, you do start to accumulate some of those things that do ultimately add value to the project. One example that I like to give quite often is, and this is rather anecdotal, but pocket doors are specified a lot more when the architect is making that decision as opposed to when the client is. Because when they hear the 2 sets of doors are going to cost them $8,000, they compartmentalize that one specific decision without considering the broader context of what we're trying to achieve on the project. And most of the time they'd say, no way, I'm not doing that.
Yeah. I mean, it's also funny because when you think about cost in that way, what I find often occurs is they'll say, I'm not going to spend, to use your example, $8,000 on pocket doors. But at the same time, if you were to use another system, it might end up costing them $5. So the difference isn't 8 to 0. It might be 5 to 8. And that extra $3,000 goes so much further if you can, for example, keep doors out of the way. It's funny with pocket doors on joinery, I tend not to like them because then I think people leave doors open and they expose the interior of what's inside. For example, back to Ari's joinery unit, the reason why I didn't want doors that would retract back and be out of the way all the time is because then I feel that he's going to just leave them open and the television's going to be on view all the time. It's this big black hole, in the center of the room. So for that very reason, I wanted just, I think we used 135-degree hinges or something like that.
Yeah.
And so the doors can go out of the way while you're watching TV, and then the doors can go back into place when you're finished. So there's a sense of order. So when the room is not being used one way, it's sort of clean and it's tidy. And I think that visual untidiness that's left can sometimes be a disruption to living in the home.
Right, yeah, that does make a lot of sense. So which package for you in the construction process is the most difficult to procure or you've had most challenges with?
A lot of our projects are literally like millimeters. They have to be millimeter perfect. And I find that, and we've had great teams most of the time on this type of stuff, but we're finding we're doing a lot of work in steel at the moment, and that steel work has to be done by someone very good. And it's not about procuring that work. It's about making sure that the contractor or the client understands that the steel work has to be millimeter perfect, because we leave a lot of things just bare. We don't cover much, you know. We're doing some multi-res work where, yes, a lot of it's all concrete structure, and a lot of it has to be covered from a fire rating perspective or an easeability, an ease of building, easeability. Is that a word? I don't know.
Building feasibility?
Easeability.
Yeah.
No, that's not a word. Anyways.
Yeah.
The point is that the idea is to make the build, you know, you got to understand what you're building, who's building it, and if we can put aside, say, a large multi-res project, when we're doing something that we're doing an office fit out in Windsor at the moment, and we did some steel glazing, internal steel glazing. Now that has to be millimeter perfect, it has to be measured on site. Someone has to come in, and I'm finding that the better that contractor is, that steel fabricator is, the better that detail is going to turn out. So it's very important in our work to make sure that we're using the right contractor.
Right, and you're finding that steel's
hard. Steel's hard to find. We've got someone good at the moment who we're using. We had someone great as well. We used on our project called Prior. But yeah, it's a lot of guys don't want to do so much steel work, you know. Like, for example, the contract we had at our project Prior, fantastic work. Like, you couldn't get better steel work. But on the next project, he didn't seem enthusiastic about taking on another project just like that. And that might be because it's tedious, it's arduous, and yeah, I'm not really sure. Maybe, but yeah, it can be tricky.
Yeah,
it can be tricky.
Isn't that often the issue? It's the guys that can do really, really amazing work often don't have the scale or the productive capacity.
Well, that's exactly what it is.
Yeah, they're more artists.
Yeah, and they're spending every single waking hour on your project, and they don't necessarily see the time for what it is. They see some simple line drawings. Everything looks very simple on plan on our drawings. But then when we start to align everything to everything, it's constant measurements. It's, like I said, everything has to be millimeter perfect. And so it becomes a little bit tiresome, I suppose, for contractors or subcontractors. Yeah.
So just a bit of a selfish question, because I'm curious for the insight. What are you looking for in a joinery contractor?
Well, I'll tell you some the positives I liked when we did our small little thing together. The shop drawings were fantastic. The site measurements were good, but it's also the willingness to discuss details, which I like, rather than an assumption of I'll just do it this way. It's that discussion, you coming to me and saying, hey, I was thinking about doing it this way, is that correct? But also sampling, not every joiner provides us with samples, and I find that frustrating, because then when something's finished and you say, well, that's not exactly what we thought it was going to be, you end up having to have a bit of an argument about it. But the provision of samples alleviates all of that concern. And it's something so simple to me, Yeah,
I do. So there's a cabinet makers Facebook group that has been a really great resource for me, and there's this common sentiment on there that I find a lot of people share is, why do we have to do shop drawings? Isn't the architect doing their job? And I feel like a lot of these guys just want to have someone come to them and say, here are the cabinets I want you to build. Just build these cabinets.
Yeah.
My feeling is that, these people probably aren't suitable for doing the quote unquote architectural work if they don't understand the value of that shop drawing to bring to the process. But do you have any thoughts on that, or?
Well, Look, I see the value in shop drawings because I think that, sure, I can go a lot further and detail more of my drawings, but you might come back to me and saying, hey, I actually can't do that. You know, my machines don't allow me to cut something in that particular way. Or actually what you've drawn uses a hinge that's going to cost us, I don't know, a couple of grand to fabricate. Maybe there's a different solution, a cheaper solution. So it's, I think to say that the architect isn't doing his job, or should the cabinet maker just do it entirely, you know, there has to be, it can't be one or the other. I think it has to be somewhere in the middle. And where you draw that line, I think will depend on the architect, will depend on the cabinet maker. But you're going to get a better result if you have a better understanding and you collaborate with one another to create something. I think also that what we do anyways is we like to rethink about things sometimes. Maybe we're reinventing the wheel, you know, and we're wasting our time. But in essence, we're trying to think about things differently. And unless you have original thought, you're going to keep doing the same thing over and over again, and you're not necessarily going to improve things. So, yeah, it's a tricky one. I understand. I mean, at the same time, I'd just say to those people, you know, okay, so then don't work on an architectural project, you know.
Yeah.
Stick to maybe being a design and build operation yourself, you know. Seek out people who just want you to come in and measure things and you just put it into place.
Yeah. So you strike me as someone who's probably thinking a lot into the future and thinking about where Ritz and GHOUGASSIAN, or where you are headed. What is your vision for?
We've started doing some projects that I think are strong from a conceptual point of view, and I think they're strong in their execution. I'd like to see these projects go through and be finalised and be built. And I think that's the hardest thing in the sort of short to medium term for us, is taking great projects and actually getting them off the ground. A lot of projects, we find clients get fatigued through the town planning process, and they'll be like, you know what, we've got the permit, let's try and sell the site. The moment they're able to sell the site, we had one project where, you know, the client sold the site after we had gone through town planning, and there was financial incentive to sell, right? So it's these things that, you know, keep some projects from being constructed. So from the short to medium term, if you said to me, hey Gil, what do you want, you know, in the next 2 years? I'd say every single project we've got on our books to be constructed. That would be fantastic.
What about further down the track?
Further down.
10, 20, 30 years. Well,
building upon that, we would love to do some institutionalized work, civic buildings, those type of projects. That'd be fantastic. That's what I'd aim for. I think that architecture can be, at a small scale, it can be a very individualistic pursuit. You know, clients come to us for a family home. Not many other people would see that home and get benefits of that architectural envelope. So if we can do some more public buildings, that'd be fantastic, because I'd love to be able to share that architectural journey, that architectural endeavour with a wider audience. You know, I think there'd be something valuable in that.
Right, so that's a really interesting perspective on scale. So in scaling might not be doing bigger, badder, you know, projects. It's how many people am I affecting? How many people are experiencing the work that I'm doing?
Yeah,
I find that really interesting.
Yeah, and I also think that in a completely different, from a different point of view as well, I think that our cities are interesting. Ever-changing organism or entity or something like that. Maybe it's just a collage, but in the sense that it'd be interesting to see how cities in the future adapt to ever sort of demanding heritage overlays, etc., and how architecture can sit within that. And I think that in the future, as a studio, we're seeing a lot of that now at a small scale, having to keep parts of buildings and doing additions at the back because of heritage reasons, keeping facades, you know. And I think there's something in that, and I'd like to see how that can, that idea can be extrapolated into larger projects in the future for the studio, and also how I guess communities can be connected, by keeping built forms of our city, how we can keep those community connections to landmarks, to buildings, and how we can create new volumes, exciting new forms out of that same relationship, keeping that relationship intact.
Yeah. So we're running out of time. So I guess I just want to close on who should get in touch with Ritz and GHOUGASSIAN.
Someone with nice large budgets. No, I'm only joking. Anyone. I mean, we take on a variety of projects. Our smallest project we're doing now would be a little extension to a home, and that's just putting a kitchen, dining, living at the end. And at the other end of the scale, we're doing multi-res. So, it's not about, I joke, but it's not about the budget, it's about the project. We want interesting projects, and we're more excited about that journey through the project than anything else.
Interesting project, someone who can align with your vision and your architectural philosophy.
For sure.
And who you can share mutual trust with.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Nicely put.
Thank you so much for your time today.
Pleasure, Charlie.
Take care.